Welcome to FO Talks. I'm Peter Isackson, Fair Observer's Chief Strategy Officer. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming back our friend Jean-Daniel Ruch, the Swiss diplomat and geopolitical thinker who's the former ambassador to Serbia and Montenegro, Israel, and Turkey, amongst other things he's done in his past. Jean-Daniel, I'd like to get your take on the very complex situation the world finds itself in today. I think we all recognize that, and especially Europe. Because of your extensive experience of West Asia, I'd like to start with the 12-Day War, which people are still trying to understand. Can you make some sense of it? Is this the beginning, middle, or end of a drama, and what drama?
Well, history is a continuous drama with some more acute phases. We have just seen an acute phase, and we cannot tell that there won't be another acute phase, maybe even in the months to go. I would like to start with two comments. Firstly, Iran has been, or Persia, has been a piece of choice on the geopolitical landscape forever. If you remember the founders of geopolitics at the end of the 19th century, like Harulf Mackinder, already he was considering that part of the world, and in particular Iran, as a key geographical area, the control of which would allow the control of what they call the heartland, namely Central Asia and in the north. So Iran today is retaining a key geostrategical position, and we can talk more about that later. That's the first thing. The second thing about the 12 Days War, the good thing is that both sides declare victory, which is good. Of course, we know that there are various assessments on who destroyed more of the other, and I'm not sure, it's almost speculation. But the point is that there is no guarantee the ceasefire will hold. Everything will depend on the resumption of nuclear talks between Washington and Iran that could be then connected to some lifting of sanctions. But there is a very high risk and maybe even a very high probability that instead of going back to nuclear negotiations, we will go back to activating the snapback sanctions in the JCPOA, which then would produce its sort of escalation of a sort with Iran considering leaving the NPT, etc. So we are at a kind of juncture where we don't really know in which direction it will go. If I had to bet on whether we'll go to a peace or to a new nuclear agreement with Trump, or rather to a diplomatic, political, economic, and maybe more escalation later, I think the balance is unfortunately on the negative side.
Yes, I noticed you said both sides declared victory. Would you say all three sides declared victory? Because is it really two sides? And what are the two sides?
Well, I would say that Iran on one hand and the Israeli-American alliance on the other side, actually. It's Israel who wanted America to go and bomb the Fordo facilities. The Americans did that in their way, and obviously there must have been some prior communication with Iran, because we know that they have removed the quantities of enriched material that was in Fordo. We know also that there must have been some communication prior to Iran's retaliation, because all this was very well choreographed, if you want, because it seems that the Iranians hit an empty base, and the Americans, basically, they hit a place where the most sensitive materials had already disappeared, and as far as we know, there were very limited casualties in terms of human casualties. But I see the Americans more as an agent of Israel than as a truly independent player. Let's not forget that when Trump came to power, he committed himself to finish the wars and, most importantly, not to enter into new wars. So this operation was not the beginning of a new war in the mind of Trump, I assume. In his mind, that doesn't mean that it is the mind of all the people around him. It was a one-off operation.
So, do you think that, I mean, some people have said that Trump has actually managed to get the upper hand over Netanyahu by declaring that the nuclear threat of Iran had now been obliterated, and therefore peace can prevail. But everyone I know seems concerned and seems to ready to predict that it will be Israel that breaks the ceasefire simply because it's a pattern we've noticed. Um, do you? What are your feelings about that? You say that Israel and U.S. are one party because they're joined at the hip, really. Is there any play of force between Trump and Netanyahu, which may be complicated as well by the internal situation in Israel? Because how stable is Netanyahu's hold over the politics in
Well, it
Israel?
seems that Netanyahu's survival as a prime minister of Israel depends on two forever wars. One in Gaza and the other one with Iran. We know that he had been wanting to strike Iran for the past 15 years at least. I think the first time there was a serious alert and Washington managed to restrain him was in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. So the continuation of war, in his view, is very much part also of his strategy to stay in power. The other thing, he can hardly compromise on a ceasefire in Gaza, certainly not a ceasefire along the terms which have been accepted by Hamas, meaning guarantees that there will not be a resumption of the war after the last hostages, living or dead, will have been released, because he knows that if he accepts this condition, then his extremists in the government, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, will leave the government. But it seems that Trump has, on the Gaza front, Trump has accepted largely that the Israelis are going to move forward with the concentration, they say it themselves, the concentration of most of the population of Gaza in a kind of camp in the southeast of Gaza, of the Strip, waiting for third countries to accept these populations. So the intent to deport at least a large part of the population is there, and Trump doesn't seem to be willing or able to do anything to restrain what amounts to a massive war crime, crimes against humanity, and maybe even this could be the ultimate evidence of the genocidal intent of the government of Israel. So it seems that Israel is implementing its agenda in Gaza. And on Iran, I think for logistical reasons, both sides, but also especially the Israelis, needed a break to be able to replenish the forces, their armaments, to lick their wounds. And maybe in 3, 4, 5 months, we will see a new round. The ultimate objective is probably more than probably for the Israelis to produce a regime change, and if possible to do that along the Syrian or Libyan model, whereby the country will be broken in several parts and it will become sort of a failed state, like Syria is a failed state today with various centrifugal forces that you cannot really bring together in a strong state. So that's probably the interest of Israel. But I think this operation of 12 days was not successful at all, because we haven't seen any serious rebellion or manifestations, demonstrations against the government. Quite the opposite. There seems to have been rather the national pride or the national feeling of uniting under the banner when the nation is under attack seems to have been prevalent against the attempts to mobilize maybe some Kurdish forces, maybe some of the Mujahideen, the leftist forces, which were apparently very much involved. I think that the Israelis could not have mounted such a successful operation with attacks within the territory, from within the territory, in particular with drones and car bombs. This could not have been possible without the complicity of the Mujahideen al-Khalq. But this is a one-off. This is not something you can repeat, probably, because this has necessitated months, if not years, of preparation. And once you've done that, I don't think you can really repeat it a second time. But definitely the objectives have not been achieved. And if it has achieved something, it is rather to strengthen the parts of the regime which are less ready to make a new nuclear deal with the Americans.
I think you've mentioned some of the complexity of the situation inside Iran, and I mean 2 points that you've just made, which I think need a bit of firming up. You believe that Israel may have been attacked in a way that the damage that was done during the war may have humiliated them to some extent. Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't say that, because to be humiliated, there needs to be public information. There needs to be publicity about the damage done. And except for some experts, especially in America, I'm thinking of Larry Johnson, who came up with very precise maps of the alleged damage, there is really not much information about that. So it would be humiliating if everybody would see that the king is naked and that Israel is not this invulnerable nation that they pretend to be. But the official discourse remains: we have destroyed much of Iran's nuclear capacity, and we have suffered only minor damage because our various anti-air systems could destroy most of the missiles and drones entering. Well, personally, I think it's wrong, but as you know, there is a cap on any information related to damage on protected sites, including military sites. So it's very, very hard to assess. So I wouldn't say it was a humiliation, but I think that they have suffered a number of blows, certainly, and that explains also why now they wanted to have a pause, and they asked the Americans to help them to make that break.
So if they're licking their wounds now, how long will they keep licking, and how much do they depend on the U.S. to be complicit in preparing the next round of the?
I think it's not only the U.S. Well, you have noticed that one of the major political change that occurred just before the beginning of the operation on the 13th of June was that the Americans changed their position in the negotiation, because there were negotiations. We should not forget that. There was even a round of negotiation planned the day after, or 2 days after the beginning of what you can call an Israeli aggression, because there was no imminent threat. And actually what they did corresponds very much to the definition of the aggression under international law. But before, there were negotiations. And 2 weeks before the operation, the Americans changed their position upon request from the Israelis or pressure. They were ready before to accept a formula similar to the nuclear arms deal, the Obama actually nuclear arms deal of 2015, namely that Iran was allowed to enrich uranium for civilian purposes until a certain level of enrichment. I think it's 3.75%, and that the enriched uranium would be stored abroad. So, and suddenly Witkoff changed its position and announced, no, from now on it will be zero enrichment, which was totally unacceptable for the Iranians. Coupled to that, there was a report from the IAEA who came right on time to justify the Israeli attack, saying that Iran is in breach of its obligations, and that created the political landscape, let's say, for the Israeli attack. Now, what I hear, including from sources of Iran, is that Pezeshkian and the people who are more, let's say, on the moderate side in Iran are still ready to go back to the negotiating table, but on the same basis as before this change of position of the Americans, namely limited uranium enrichment capability coupled with the storing of enriched material abroad, which was basically the JCPOA model. We don't know what the Americans want. But what we know is that the Europeans, and there they are playing a role, probably also motivated or pushed by the Israelis. We know that the E3, namely the UK, France, and Germany, may push in the weeks to come for the Security Council to adopt the so-called snapback sanctions, which were foreseen in the JCPOA. And that would probably signal an escalation, because then it would again give arguments to the hardliners in the regime in Tehran to say, let's forget the NPT, we'll never manage to find a deal with the Westerners, so let's go full speed to the nuclear option, because at the end of the day, this is the only way for us to ensure our defense.
So, if there's an escalation, how would it take place? Who would be the escalator, if you like?
Well, the first step in the, I
Right.
think the first step in the escalation ladder would be this move by the Europeans. You know, they could pretend we have the report of the IAEA, they are in breach of their obligations again under the JCPOA, so we are entitled, legally speaking, to ask for a return to the sanctions, to the so-called snapback sanctions,
So,
and that would be the first step.
how
And then that could very well evolve in a crisis, especially if the Iranians then make the moves to withdraw from the NPT. Then that could give arguments not just for the Israelis, or certainly for the Israelis, to push also the Europeans this time to join in an active action against the Iranians. We know that the Europeans, if I may just finish, we know that that a few European countries were involved in defending Israel during the 12 Days War by helping to shoot down some of the drones and missiles. But I think what Israel would like is to bring them also to an active role in a possible future round, which is extremely dangerous, of course, because then it would force probably the Russians, maybe the Chinese, to have a much more active participation also.
And haven't the Europeans got their hands full with trying to deal with the Ukraine issue, where they're ready to compromise their ability even to maintain social services in the interest of building up their weapon stocks and their aggressive posture within NATO? Does that make any sense to that? Israel might count on Europeans who appear to me to be particularly feeble, very vulnerable at this point in time.
Well, they have some capacities, including some military capabilities. We know that they are providing weapons. They even want to continue and to increase their support to Ukraine, but they have also their own assets, in particular air assets, which could be very useful in a new war against Iran. Now, the capabilities are there. Now, what is the strategic interest of Europe? Well, for me, it is a mystery. I don't think that there is any strategic interest for Europe to participate to a defensive or offensive war against Iran on the side of the US and Israel, just like of Europe would be to find as soon as possible an arrangement to stop the fighting with Russia and be able to restart the deliveries of energy material at cheap price, like oil and gas, from Russia through the Nord Stream or else. But this is the true strategic interest of Europe. The strategic interest of Europe is also to help the landlines connecting China and Europe, either through Russia or through the Middle Corridor. But I'm not sure how. I'm not sure anybody in Brussels, Paris, London, or Berlin sees it that way.
When you say anybody, you're talking about the political leadership, I think, because
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
What are you? Yeah, because what are Europeans themselves? I'm a European. Uh, what's their feeling about this, and how would they react if any of these things happen? That is, even the commitment to the 5% of defense spending is causing a lot of anguish and concern, which people are not totally aware of until they see the effects when new budgets come out for each of the countries, which will be later in the year. But I know here in France, this is the case that people are just wondering. They think they have a moral duty with regard to Ukraine. They don't necessarily think they have a moral duty to defend Israel. And the idea that the defense is going to be the major item in the budget and it's going to eat up everything else is going to produce a reaction here in France, for example, but I imagine in many other
I'm not
countries.
sure.
And now I'm hearing that.
I'm not sure, Peter. First, you know the story of the frog which is boiling slowly, or the frog that you throw in boiling water. Well, look, there has been already significant inflation throughout Europe, especially because of the higher energy prices over the past 3 years. And there is a resilience in the population. Of course, they are not happy, but this does not translate into mass demonstrations. Have you ever seen a demonstration, a significant demonstration to demand the end of the support to Ukraine? No, maybe in Poland, because Poland is in a different situation, of course. But I don't see that there is so far that there is a potential for the people in Europe to really take a tough stance that could influence the policies of the French or the British or the German governments.
But none of those leaders have much support politically. If there were elections in each of these countries today, I think they would all be thrown out, even though we don't know who.
I'm not sure. Look, Merz came to power very recently, and those who were opposing him on really serious policy options like Ukraine, Russia, they like AFD or the leftist party, they didn't do that well. So I think as you can say that this strategic option, this pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western, pro-American policy option, enjoy a significant majority in Germany. In France, I don't think that anybody is asking anything to the people or even to the parliament. So that's very
Well, I don't.
much a centralized ruling as it has always been. And then there the question is, will there be consequences during the next presidential election? I don't know. I'm not sure because there will be a candidate of the establishment, maybe Edouard Philippe or somebody else, against a candidate from the Rassemblement National, so the Le Penist, and again they will be able to play, against the Le Penists as the extreme right and to play that sort of game. So I'm not sure it's going to have significant implications for the political landscape in Europe. Also, it's amazing how easily van der Leyen has been re-elected, even though her performance has been less than optimal, to say the least. But look, there was no question she has been re-elected. So it seems that
Well, she's being
the
serious.
ruling elite in Europe remains solidly in position.
Van der Leyen is being seriously contested now for a number of things, including Pfizergate. But there's a lot of complaints about the way she's running things. There's a growing awareness in some circles, and I admit those circles are limited, that she is not a democratically elected leader, and that what she's doing is very, her behavior is, you would qualify more as monarchic behavior than democratic behavior. And then going back to France, we've got a wild card you haven't mentioned, and that's Dominique de Villepin, who's making a lot of noise in the media. And that's important because the media have pretty much controlled all the debates in the way that you were mentioning, that keep people just calmly accepting their role, or the role of Europe as being the vassal of the US. But Dominique de Villepin, for example, is insisting on the fact that France should not be a vassal
I agree
state.
with you.
That,
And I like very much what Dominique de Villepin is saying, because he's one of the very few charismatic person in Europe who is saying the right thing. And for me, the right thing is to start by using the European values as a compass of your policy. And European values means international law. You have also Gérard Haraud, a former French ambassador to Washington, who is also very much saying the same thing. And those people are not afraid to name a spade and to say that, yes, the Israeli attack against Iran or the American attack against Iran were illegal. This was violation of international law. That, yes, what is happening in Gaza is dramatically illegal. This amounts to war crimes against humanity and maybe genocide. And very few people in the establishment are capable of doing that. Villepin is capable of doing that. His weak point is firstly that he did not leave very good memories of when he was Prime Minister of France. And secondly, he does not really have a machinery around him on which, in every province, in every department, in every canton, that he
but
can use to do his bidding.
but neither did Macron
So that's
in
why.
2017. So, and people are making parallels. In fact, a lot of people are insulting Dominique de Villepin by calling him a remake of Macron 2017, which is a good measure of the dissatisfaction with Macron himself amongst the people. If you can use calling someone another Macron as an insult, it means that Macron's popularity is not what it should be for a
Yes.
president.
No, don't mistake me. I think it would be really good for Europe and for Europe to develop a true strategic autonomy. Macron has been was the first, I think, already in 2017 or so, to
Yeah.
use the word strategic autonomy, but it never happened. And if there is somebody who might be capable of developing a really strategic thinking, an independent strategic thinking, it is definitely Dominique de Villepin. But for the time being, because of what I said, I think his chances are less than 20%.
But he has 2 years ahead of him to organize himself. I'm not counting on that, but I find it interesting from one basic point of view, and that is that the media in France are absolutely in total conformity with the official policies of a vassal government on foreign policy. There's no way of getting people to of anyone in the media pushing people to reflect about the real stakes and the real causes of whatever's happening in the world today. The only thing they'll talk about with any degree of sense of debate would be internal problems in France. But Dominique de Villepin is the one person who's regularly invited into the media because of his personality, and he's making this case. So, could it have some impact? I hope so. I'm not counting on it either. Uh, but let's go back to something else. Go back to the original question in the Middle East, and that is, especially with Iran. There's one thing people don't talk about, and we haven't talked about it. Iran is part of BRICS. And do you think that the reason suddenly you had this violent attack, I mean, a true act of war against Iran by Israel, that was precipitated in complicity with the US as a means that both parties are interested in of containing or destroying one of the key elements of BRICS?
Yeah, well, not sure if the BRICS is the right framework to talk about that. What is certain is that both Russia and China are investing a lot in new corridors. The North-South corridor,
And
running from St. Petersburg to basically to India, or to the Indian Ocean, and the same thing for China over Afghanistan. So I think that there is definitely an interest, a Western interest, to counter these moves by the Russians and by the Chinese. For the Chinese, it is in the context of the New Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road initiative, which the Americans, of course, see as a big challenge to their supremacy, because it could migrate some of the commercial transportation from the sea to the land, and it would be outside of the control of the Western world, mostly the naval powers. This is Mahan. These are also the first pioneers of geopolitical thinking in the second half of the 19th century. We're talking about the importance of naval power to control the commercial sea lanes, and this which leads from Asia to Europe through the Malacca Strait and the Suez Canal. Now we see a big challenge to this, let's say, world order by the development of land routes, by the way, which are working. There is a route from Xi'an through Russia, through Ukraine, to Germany, which is functioning. So the Chinese are exporting their goods, despite the war, all the way to Western Europe by land. And the second major challenge is the development of an Arctic route. It's not a coincidence. It's not a kind of craziness of Trump to say, I want to control Canada and Greenland. There are very, very, very strong strategic interests, both military, but also commercial and economic interests for the Americans who want to beef up their presence in northern Canada and in Iceland and in northern Greenland, so as not to let the Russians and the Chinese, who have much more developed their capabilities to control that part, including with icebreakers, to control that part of the world. But coming back to Iran, being able to prevent Iran to become this kind of big hub of communication between Russia and India on the one hand, between China, Iran, and then the West, including Western Europe, on the other hand, is definitely a strategic interest of the West, of the Americans. And they have their counter proposal. And their counter proposal is to connect the Arab world, the Sunni Arab world, together with Israel, so as to create new connectivity corridors between the Gulf and Europe, but this time through Israel. Through Israel, and now they can also use Syria, which seems to have fallen in their camp, through Turkey. Turkey is playing sort of an ambiguous game in that part. I think they are trying to play on both registers, but it seems to me that Turkey sees the interest of coordinating closely with the Western world to implement this project, which is connected to the Abraham Accords completely. Now the missing link remains Saudi Arabia, and what is happening in Gaza, I don't know if one day the Saudi Arabia or the other Arabs will be able to accept that the price that Israel will have no price to pay for destroying and deporting a whole population. For the time being, it seems rather unlikely because the Saudis have made it clear that there will be no normalization with Israel unless there is hope for a Palestinian state. But we cannot really say that the Israelis have done anything to come along the Saudis' interests and demands. The other thing that has to be said that there is one country, one country which is or new region which is playing a crucial role in these geopolitical games, and it is the Southern Caucasus, because another way to cut this north-south connection between Russia and Iran is to bring together Armenia and Azerbaijan and to create what they call the Zangezur corridor that would cut across Armenia in the southern part of Armenia, so as to connect Azerbaijan, Baku, with its exclave of Nakhichevan bordering Turkey. And that would create that would be a sort of a missing piece on the middle corridor to connect Central Asia with Western Europe. Now, one thing is the access to the direct access or an easier access to Azeri oil and gas for Europe, which is in dire need because of the situation with Russia, but also with Central Asia. And again, we go back to Mackinder and to the forefathers of geopolitics. Central Asia is the heartland. Who controls Central Asia controls the world. And right now you can see that there are lots of rivalries between the Russians, the Chinese, and the Western world to control the resources of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. And I think that what's going on with Iran has also to be seen under that angle.
Yes, and Turkey would be a major player in that. And some people are saying that.
Well, of course.
But Turkey, we saw how they maneuvered in the Syria situation, and to some extent, would you agree that they control or they're sharing control over the way Syria is evolving with Israel? Is that a fair characterization? It's not control, but
Al-Julani or Al-Shara, as he's called today, was definitely a proxy of Turkey. I mean, he was he had found refuge with his troop in a remote corner of Syria, bordering only Turkey, and he could get all the supplies he needed only through Turkey. So, of course, he's sort of a pawn in the hands of Turkey with some sort of independence. Now, to say that the Turks are the only ones who control Syria through al-Shara is wrong, because the Israelis are controlling not just the Golan, but they have extended their zone of control. They are controlling the water of Mount Hermon. Then you still have the unsolved problem of the Kurds in the northeast. There are negotiations, but I'm not sure this will really lead to a strong Syria. And I think that has been the policy of Israel in other places also, divide et impera. And I think it's certainly in the interest of Israel that Syria does not become again a very strong centralized state that could pose a threat to Israel. And frankly, the signs are now rather positive for Israel, because there is talk of Syria joining the Abraham Accords. There are even talks or there are rumors of talks on finding an arrangement for the Golan Heights. There was this very old idea. I remember even Switzerland contributed to that 15 or 20 years ago, to make out of the Golan a sort of recreation park, which would be accessible from both sides.
So
Well, why not?
complements
Maybe
the
this.
Riviera in Gaza, does it? Is it a complement to the
Well,
Riviera in Gaza?
not quite, because it does not presupposes the displacement of a whole population.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is that the Golan is very scarcely populated. I think all in all, if you count the Arabs or the Syrians or the Druze, it's mostly Druze, and the Jewish settler population, I'm not sure you reach much more than 60 or 70,000 people, so nothing to compare with the 2 million people living in Gaza. But the point is that there are advanced conversations. Now, what is sure is that in Syria, the Turkish and Israeli interests are rather at odds. But when it's about containing Iran's influence in the region, there are some common interests. And let's not forget that despite all the anti-Israeli and pro-Palestinian rhetoric of President Erdogan, the Azeri oil continues to flow through Ceyhan, through the Turkish port of Ceyhan, to Israel. So Turkey is playing a very ambiguous game, let's say. They are trying really to play on all fronts and not to confront any of the big players. You know, when I landed in Turkey, of course, I asked meeting with my colleagues from the important countries. So when I met the Iranian ambassador, I think the first thing he told me, I was coming from Israel, I was in Turkey. And he told me, well, you know, the future of this region will be defined by this country, Turkey, my country, Iran, and the country you were before, Israel.
Yes.
And I think this is still very much the paradox of the situation in that part of the world, that the three non-Arab countries are the ones who hold the best cards in their hands. It all depends what will happen. Saudi Arabia could make a difference. And we have seen some attempts by Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, to develop an autonomous policy. But in the last period, I think that this has receded, and we don't really see how Saudi Arabia could become, let's say, an autonomous, strong actor or the leader of the Arab world, maybe together with Egypt. They have tried. Actually, maybe the best thing they have done recently and the most daring has been to propose a reconstruction plan for Gaza. Everybody has forgotten about that. But it was a very smart plan, very good, very reasonable, that involved also the governance. Of course, Hamas would not be involved in any sort of governance, where there was serious plans for the reconstruction, and including the price tag, which was not as extravagant as you might think. Well, it was already 1 year ago, so probably the price is higher today. But this shows how much these countries lack the teeth and the influence and the impact in Washington or in Europe, because their plan was simply disregarded by Israel and nobody else picked up on that plan, which I think is a pity. because that would be very much in the interest of Europe also, that something like that would come to fruition.
So that supposes that we have leaders who actually think about the uh, the stakes and the consequences of whatever decisions they have to make, and then that you get the right coalition of interests, which is about the most difficult thing to find today, because everyone's got an interest that's linked to something else, but none of, and this is the problem of Europe itself. The 27 countries of Europe are not, even though they're functioning under the leadership of von der Leyen, which is, I would say, functioning under the leadership of NATO. I don't know if you agree with that, but it's not. It's not a unified decision-making machine.
Well, we have seen that we have seen that very recently, and we may see that on the 15th of July again, when the EU was supposed to decide on suspending the association agreement or part of the association agreement with Israel, and we've seen how deeply divided the EU is. But the EU is also very much divided on the idea that Ukraine should join the club. You know, Hungary is vocally opposed to Ukraine joining. So this is Europe. You know, the main merit of Europe, Peter, is that they manage to make peace among themselves. We should not ask too much from Europe. And we see that when it comes to projecting power or operations away from Europe, then the old constellations resurface, like the UK and France, sometimes with Germany when it's about Iran. This is more the constellation which has the say, not so much the EU as EU. Now, I'm not sure I quite understand the strategy behind that, because I cannot imagine it's just the vassalization of Europe for the sake of American interests. I do believe that you have also, well, Germany is a special case because Germany and Israel is a complicated story, as we all know. But the UK and France, I think they have their own share of vested interest, national interest, which very much often coincide. And it's often about the big companies, you know, the major companies, the major French and British companies like Total or British Petroleum, which I believe, maybe if you look for a common denominator explaining the policies of the UK and France, maybe you have to go back and see what are the interests of some of the big multinationals, and the biggest, I mean, the significant one are probably Total and British Petroleum. So what are their interests there? And maybe that is a key to explain the policies of France and the UK in that part of the world. Regarding Germany, I think it's just a pity that you have the leader of a democratic European country, which is whitewashing an act of aggression by saying, well, Israel is doing the dirty job for us.
Yeah.
And Germany has been a key player in promoting international law, a world ruled by international law, a world ruled by international justice. I think to this day, they are still the main contributor to the International Criminal Court, which has indicted the prime minister of the country, which is doing the dirty job for us. I mean, how can you say things like that? It is total contradiction with the stated values and principles of the country.
Okay, I'd like to conclude just with a last question, going back to something we've talked about previously in previous conversations. Everyone seems to agree that the world we see today is one in which diplomacy, which is what you have practiced, has been discarded. I don't know if you agree with that, but it seems to me that we're looking at all kinds of events that are taking place simply because diplomacy is not considered to be the most obvious way to solve problems. Uh, if that's true, and if we look around us and see acts of war, violations of international law, policies that are defined by applying sanctions systematically, acts of duplicity, uh, choreographed terrorist operations like the spiderweb thing, or what Israel did in Lebanon with the pagers. When we look at all these things going on and an absence of diplomacy, is that the world we live in today, and is it going to be the world of tomorrow, or is
This
there
is
a
not
future?
new. Unfortunately, this is not new, Peter. I think I wrote in my book, which was published last year, that one thing that was striking to me when I was active as also a special envoy for the Middle East, but this is something I have realized also later when I was ambassador in Serbia, in Israel, or in Turkey, is that those who have the most important role in the relations between states are not the diplomats. They are much more the spooks, the CIA, the MI6, the DGS, and others.
And they're all working together in all these operations.
And they have a lot. They have a lot of money. You know, the means attributed to diplomats and to those wishing to promote good offices or negotiations are always more restricted, and everybody is investing now in the security, be it military or intelligence and so on. So these people are swimming in money, and they have incredible networks, and they are the ones who are actually who have the say and who have the influence. As you said, these networks, they know each other, they are working together, they have been doing that for years and years and years. I see that in my own country, in Switzerland. There is, I mean, when I'm kind, I say there is a cognitive bias in favor of the US, in favor of NATO, in favor of Israel, even though we are supposed to be a neutral state. But it's much more than that, actually. It's interconnections which have been there for years. And these groups, let's put it this way, these networks are defining Western foreign policy much more than Mr. Trump or Mr. Macron or any political leaders. Because I'm trying to think of an American president or French president or any political leader who really defied these groups.
Well, maybe
Well, maybe Chirac and Schröder in the times of Iraq, maybe.
but if you go back
But
to
I think this is
Kennedy and De Gaulle, maybe that was the last
yeah.
golden
But I
age.
think in those days, networks were not as strong
Yeah,
as they are today, with a lot of money. You know, to give you an example, you've seen the billions which are going into the think tanks, and that's why also it's hard to find a think tanker who is a true independent voice, because they
yeah,
all somewhat receive money from the same sources.
yeah.
So it's very hard to be critical against the policies of your state or of NATO or of the America, when on the other hand you receive your salary from these very sources. And this is all feeding a kind of military industry or warmongering machinery, which is saying we have to invest more on defense, more on arms. But who is saying we can invest more on arms? I have nothing against. I do believe in that military balance may lead to peace. But at the same time, as you talk about investing in military industry, you should talk at the same time about offering new talks about disarmament. I mean, finally, we had a treaty on the conventional forces in Europe, which was working fine for a while, and now it has been scrapped. We had a whole architecture of nuclear treaties. The only one which is still staying, the SALT II treaty, will come to an end in January 2026. Why don't we talk more about the necessity to disarm and to restart meaningful arms control negotiations? This is diplomacy. And this
Yeah.
is the kind of diplomacy that was carried out during the Cold War, which led to a number of successes, including a significant reduction of strategic armed forces, meaning nuclear armed forces. But nobody is talking about that. We're only investing on one aspect, on one leg, which is the armaments. I will give you a small anecdote at my very small level. If you want to make a seminar today about NATO and Ukraine and when should Ukraine join NATO and the expansion of NATO, you will easily find dozens of thousands of dollars to organize your conference. I organized, together with a few groups from the civil society from 6 different countries, a colloquium in Geneva 2 weeks ago about neutrality and the importance of creating a network of neutral states in the world to try precisely to talk about peace and negotiations and diplomacy instead of war to solve problems. It was impossible to find 42,000 Swiss francs to organize that. Eventually, we did it, but without any sort of support from anybody, because it's much more profitable to invest into war than to invest into peace.
Yeah. Well, Eisenhower warned about that when I was 14 years old. And you can watch that on YouTube, but I don't think anyone has taken it seriously since then, or at least since November '63, when they managed to eliminate a president who appeared to take that seriously. But that's another story. But it's
Yeah, that's
always
another story. I mean, I cannot claim I know the circumstances of JFK's
no, but
murder. So I don't.
it's something I've been interested in all most of my life. And I recently interviewed Jefferson Morley, who's the great researcher on that particular thing. And interesting things are happening now, thanks to the Trump administration, because we are getting some serious confirmation of what was previously called a conspiracy theory that involved obviously the CIA, organized crime, the mafia, and the military as well. Uh, so we're learning about these things, and maybe knowledge can help us understand and help our politicians to create policies that make some sense in terms of the sense of history itself. Anyway, on that note, unless you have anything else to say, or last, if you want to wind it up with some philosophical
No,
pronoun-
well, well, I would like just to repeat what I just said.
yeah,
Uh, I think it's our duty as citizens to develop a culture of independence, impartiality, and neutrality while condemning violations of international law. And that, I think, that only can help the world become what it should be, which means a truly global village where everybody is tackling the real problem that we all face, for instance, climate, but not only that, in a cooperative spirit, because the spirit of confrontation does not bode well for the future.
no. Not only climate, I would also mention AI, which is something the
Oh,
world
yes.
needs to concert on. Yeah, yeah,
Yes. By the way, the AI was a very important topic. We had a whole working group dealing with digital neutrality. We call that. And it's
exactly.
about the risks posed by AI. Yes.
That's something I'd like to talk to you about at some future point.
Let's do that.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean Daniel. It's always not just a pleasure, but very informative to listen to you and exchange ideas. So I hope to see you again in the near future, and have a good summer.
Thank you very much, Peter. Have a great summer.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.